So we have these like 70 indicators, and they fall under like these big buckets. So like if we're thinking about it, it's demographics, economics, education, health, neighborhood dynamics, public safety, and social cohesion. So those are the big buckets, and then all like the drilling down further, you come up with 70. What's really cool about it, there's so many cool things that are about it. I can go on and on about it. And I know that
There's
we're
70
like talking,
cool things about it.
Right? There's 70. There's probably more. You know, it's always better when you can see it. But the way to be thinking about this is that's step one, right? So you create this machine learning using big data, looking at all of these risk and protective factors for a specific jurisdiction. Hello, everyone. I'm Lori Toscano, Director of Justice Technical Assistance at WestEd, and you're listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast.
You're listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast, your go-to space for all things public health and global health, from the Sustainable Development Goals to the social determinants of health, as well as interesting dialogues about the diverse career opportunities that exist in these fields. Remember to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts and Spotify so other people like you can benefit from our content.
Of course, you've focused on violence prevention more broadly in your career. We're here to talk specifically about gun violence. One of the questions that I don't have an answer to, so I'm going to ask it, and I think you would be a great person to point me in the right direction. You just said how gun violence is now a leading cause of death in many demographics. How do we get to this point now with all the various political tools and legislation and different kind of innovations that we have in our arsenal? How do we still get to this point where gun violence is one of the leading causes of death? Are there any things that come to mind in terms of moments where certain political decisions were made, or are any other moments in history that have driven us to this point?
Yeah.
Is there even an answer to that question?
I don't know, to be quite honest. I definitely don't think that there's one answer, right? But I'm thinking about the work that I've done in all kind of the different spaces. And, you know, when I was at Cure Violence, it was that violence is a learned behavior, right? So if you're chronically exposed to violence, if you see this within your home or your community, within your school, that it's more likely that you're going to be engaged in that type of behavior, which I think still stands.
So exposure increases the risk. Right.
Yeah. Definitely exposure increases the risk. And if you think about being chronically exposed and potentially suffering from the trauma of that, how you live your life and how you respond in situations might be different now, right? If I have a significant trauma history and I'm still in that like hypervigilant stage, I might think that carrying a gun would make me safer. But the reality is maybe I get myself involved in a situation that becomes a conflict and I have a gun. And so that now the likelihood that I use it obviously is increased as well. So there's those pieces. But I think what at this point in my career, what I'm really trying to look at is kind of what's been done to community historically, right? Okay. And that looks different in a lot of different ways. But, you know, big picture could be disinvestment, right? And that could be intentional or it could be based on scarcity of resources, right? I'd like to think that everyone wants every community to be safe and healthy and successful. I think that at this point and kind of where we are as a society it's really overwhelming to figure it out, right? This didn't happen overnight. I don't think that there's like any quick fix solution. I think that the rise of community violence intervention and the funding of that type of work has been phenomenal. And now I think it's okay if community violence intervention is really focused on working with individuals at the highest risk for involvement in violence, right? Or places where violence is most likely to happen. Got that covered, right? You have this body of work that is working in that space. I think where I'm curious about and what I'm trying to kind of like, you know, move my work in this direction is what does primary prevention look like? How do we get to the underlying factors that either help to prevent violence from occurring, right? Or what are the protective factors we need to bolster? What are the risk factors that we need to mitigate, right? How do we get to these underlying factors? Will that be what creates systemic change? I think that there have been, there are folks obviously working in those spaces, right? And there's good work happening in those spaces. But I think for me, like where I am now in my career is that part of the missing piece? If we're able to focus on risk and protective factors, if we're able to say this is what's happening within a city, a neighborhood, a community, and put all of our time and energy into mitigating risk factors, increasing protective factors, is that where change would come? I don't know, but in my mind, that's, I know for me in my work and the work that I've been involved in, that is a missing piece that is of greatest interest to me.
I like the framing around that too, because I always think about public health issues as looking at the root causes, the causes of the causes. Is the outcome of gun violence more of a symptom of a larger problem rather than the problem itself, things like that? And I think you're saying there are drivers of gun violence that have nothing to do with gun violence itself necessarily. And so looking at those things, is that sufficient enough to, because, and I was going to touch on this, but I'll touch on it now. One of my favorite quotes that I like is from American philosopher John Dewey. And basically the quote is, a problem well defined is a problem half solved. So if you talk about the problem and you get on the same page about what the problem is, only then are you able to have solutions that make sense for how you describe the problem. So even when you go back to talking about gun violence as a crisis or a criminal justice crisis versus a public health crisis, that narrative actually does influence how you approach it, right? So if you're talking about it as a public health issue, you're looking at the things external to gun violence that contribute. But then if you're more narrow focused on, well, it's a criminal justice issue, we need to just get rid of guns and then everything will be great, then you miss sort of the bigger point. So I think I like how you framed that piece there.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's a huge issue. And again, right, like I don't think that there's any one answer, but I think I read a book. I'm looking up at it because I know it's up here somewhere. Oh, there it is. It is called, hold on, I'm going to get it.
Let's get it.
Yeah. As I knock everything down. But have you ever heard of this book? Prison by Any Other Name?
Ooh.
Really interesting. I believe that part of me feels like I had to read it in grad school, but it's the harmful consequences of popular reforms. But there's something that translates beyond even like, the scope of what the book is about. But there was some point in, I don't know if it was in the prologue, at some point in this book, the authors say, if this is the only way, kind of like what I was talking about earlier, like if this is all we have to come up with, like, oh, that's a little depressing that we don't have the imagination, right? If the only things are enforcement, suppression, or primary prevention.
Right. Recycle, rinse, repeat.
Yeah. Like this is, but I get it to a certain extent too. Like I get that resources are challenging, right? There's only a certain number of resources. So having the space to try things, right? To test things, it's a hard thing to do. And we're also talking about like, you can't try and test things on people. Like that's not it, right? So it's like, if you want to start to think about this issue through a different lens, what could that look like? Can you have the space to think about it? I don't know, right? It's such a huge issue, but I think that we've made so much progress in the space. I was pulling together when I knew I was going to be talking to you. I was pulling together some stats, and Philadelphia is near and dear to me because of our Pennsylvania project and working with so many community-based organizations in that space. And homicides are down 43%. So then it's like, okay, what's going on, right? Like, is it
from the previous year, or like what's the time?
43%.
Wow.
Yeah. And it says, my notes say, to a level not seen in a decade.
Okay, so not only is it down 40%, where it is now is the lowest it's been in a decade.
Let's double check that, Gordon, you and
Wow.
I. But yeah. I mean, I think that's the
That's
thing, right?
pretty significant.
There's a significant amount of cities that are seeing reductions in homicides currently. There are some that aren't, right? So I think, it's learning from those cities what's working, right? And being able to see, can you adapt those strategies to your local context in your specific city or neighborhood or community, right? So I think that's like the one piece of the puzzle, or a big piece of the puzzle. But I think, this idea of underlying risk and protective factors, like, is that, I don't want to say it's missing, because I'm sure people are working on this, and people are working on the specific things, when the work that we're doing, at West Ed. So, right, I'm relatively new to West Ed. And one of the things that West Ed does is this thing called internal strategic investments. So they're like, come to us with an idea. And if we think that there's value to it, we'll fund it. So I was like, oh my gosh, never had that, opportunity
Like
before.
a little Shark Tank.
Yeah, it is like a little internal Shark Tank. Yeah. We should do
really
it that
cool.
way, but it is really fun. It's a cool process. But once I knew that was possible, one of my colleagues, Sean Ali at West Ed, that we work together on the same team, he introduced me to his colleagues at an organization called Muflahoon. Muflahoon is an organization that's focused on countering violent extremism, right?
okay.
So they created this, I don't know if they would describe it as framework, but it's called CRUISE, which is Community Resilience Early Warning System, right? So it's kind of this big data machine learning where they can look at the risk and protective factors that might make it more likely or less likely for violent extremism to occur. They've created this data analytics system. Yeah, this model. I was like, oh my gosh, that's the coolest thing ever, right? Like, I've never seen it. And again, I think also visualizations, right? Like, love to be able to see it. Like, you're not just showing me numbers or data and I'm maybe faking it till I make it. I'm like, oh, this is super interesting. Like, tell me more. This is, I can see it, which I love. So I got to see it and I thought it was just phenomenal. And we were just all in conversation. And I don't know if it was myself or someone else, but someone said, could this be adapted for gun violence? And they were like, totally. There's risk and protective factors have been identified for gun violence. We can use those factors in the machine learning piece of the modeling of it, right? And it was just the coolest thing ever. And I think, I could be wrong. I've been wrong many a time in my life. But I didn't know of anybody who was doing this, in this space, in the gun violence space. Obviously, there's a lot of data analysis. There's a lot of incident level data, hotspots, looking at frequency, looking at clustering, looking at, the stats of there's only this % of the population that's most likely involved that's driving the violence. There's amazing data analytics at play. But I didn't know about it in this, in kind of like using it in this way. So kind of this zoomed out, right? So
and
now
also
we're talking
not outcome driven, but you can learn. You're
foundational,
yeah.
Right? This is showing you right now.
You're getting into the nuances.
Yeah. It's one of those things where it's like, how would you say, no, that's not correct, right? So the Violence Prevention Navigation Framework was funded by West Ed to work with Muflahoon to build out the data analytics portion of it, right? And so the idea is that there are 70 indicators for gun violence, right? At the community and societal level, right? So we're not talking about individuals, right? We're not trying to go into personal information. We're really thinking about this also we don't want to be zooming into being able to give people this bad people, bad places, right? We want to move away from all of that. So let's look at this kind of zoomed out
neighborhood level,
primary prevention, upstream, community level data. So we have these 70 indicators and they fall under these big buckets. So if we're thinking about it, it's demographics, economics, education, health, neighborhood dynamics, public safety, and social cohesion. So those are the big buckets, and then all like the drilling down further, you come up with 70. What's really cool about it, there's so many cool things there about it. I can go on and on about it, and I know that
There's
we're
70
like talking,
cool things about it.
Right? There's 70. There's probably more. You know, it's always better when you can see it. But the way to be thinking about this is that's step one, right? So you create this machine learning using big data, looking at all of these risk and protective factors for a specific jurisdiction, right? What it does is it shows you which risk and protective factors. Well, first off, it doesn't identify which is which. So it's not already assigning this is a risk factor and this is a protective factor.
Right.
It's just all factors, right?
Right.
So the analytics will show you this is showing up in this specific place as a risk factor, right? This is showing up as a protective factor. So if I have that information as a city or a county leader, a state leader, well, then I want to invest in the protective factors. I want to keep bolstering them. And if you're telling me that, let's say transportation is showing up as a risk factor, why? Right? Is that then where I should put my time and energy and effort? Right? Maybe. But this is just phase one, the data analytics. It's just the spotlight. So it's showing you that these things, these factors are the ones that are showing up. It's showing you, is it showing up as a risk factor or a protective factor? Right? And instead of being like, I'm going to look at all 70, I can prioritize. So I can say, I want to look at the top 10 factors. I could say, I want to look at the top risk and the top protective. I can say, I only want to focus on protective. I only want to focus on risk, whatever the case may be. But it's the spotlight effect. So it's showing me what's having the most impact in this space and how is it impacting it? Is it protecting or is it creating additional risk? The next phase of it, right? Phase two, or element two, component two, however you want to talk about it, is the people's perspective. All we're seeing is numbers. All it's saying to us is, in this example, transportation is a risk factor. I have no idea why. I can, in the data portion of things, I can look at the change over time. So I can say, did this show up in the same way 10 years ago? I could look at 10 years ago and all of a sudden it's a protective factor. What changed? Right? So then I get to go into this like deeper, like the qualitative side of things, right? Where you want to talk to individuals that have most knowledge of whatever it is. So let's say transportation. First off, I want to talk to community. I want to talk to people that have lived this experience, right? That can give you their perspective on what's changed over time, in this case with transportation. I want to talk to folks at the Department of Transportation, right? I want to talk to all of these folks that might be able to give me a better understanding of why things are the way that they are. What changed
and that's
over
even
time.
before. I like so you're building the phases. So it's not, transportation risk factor. Okay, let's invest in because you don't know the mechanism of how that works. So you're talking about getting more information to understand the interplay between transportation and gun violence. So
exactly.
Keep going.
Right.
I'm following.
So it's doing that piece of the puzzle. So then it's like overlaying it. So then it's saying, okay, I have this visualization, these data analytics that show me which factors are at play here. I talk to folks that are experts in this space. I talk to folks that have their own expertise based on their lived experience, and I get a clearer understanding. I merge the two together, and what does it tell me, right? Like, what is this showing me? Can I get a sense of things that have worked historically that might work again? Can I get a sense of, this might be where we're saying, okay, if this is what we're prioritizing, let's say we just say, like, transportation is showing up. People have confirmed it's showing up. The next phase of it would be, or like almost the final phase of it is, what are the recommendations, right? What can you do what could you do short-term, mid-term, long-term, right? Here are recommendations. What could you do with little to no resources, a moderate amount of resources, or a significant amount of resources? Because I think what's really cool about this, for a variety of reasons, and I could go on and on because I love this so much, but what's really cool about this is, for me, when people think about violence prevention, I am not sure if that many people would be like, let's talk about the role of the Department of Transportation in violence prevention. Maybe some people would, right?
Not necessarily.
I feel like if you're
but
maybe, and if you're in the space,
thing. You would sound, imagine being in a conversation, let's talk about transportation. People would be like, okay, Lori,
Yeah.
that's enough.
But it's so cool. But it's so cool because I think someone had said this to me a long time ago too, that I was always like, yeah, there's real value in that. Definitely. Everyone has a role to play in violence prevention. So this is now saying,
showing that.
yeah. And if we're thinking about how to address these underlying factors to either, reduce this, increase this, but it's really talking about like safer, healthier communities. Going back to like your public health background, right? But like that's really what we're talking about, right? These aren't the traditional things of bring in violence interrupters or let's think about community policing strategies. Like this is something completely separate. All of those things are happening, right? But when we think about like the violence prevention ecosystem, this is totally front end, primary prevention. These are the societal and community
helps
level
us
factors.
Address other issues as well, right?
100%.
That are it's not so 100%. Anyways, oh my gosh.
And then it's kind of like, what I think is cool about is A, the prioritization of the factors, but also being able to say, like, to the point of our conversation, like, it's taken us a very long time. Like, we're here with violence being a public health crisis, right? This has been going on for quite some time, This isn't something that is going to change overnight. However, we see all of these promising practices with the like intervention level work that's happening in the world. We know that folks are working closely with youth in these spaces, in the prevention space, in arts, in sports, in recreation, in schools, in wraparound services, in positive youth development. Super cool. We know folks are thinking about like crime prevention through environmental design. So we know folks are thinking about space.
Yes.
This is just, in my mind, the like deeper, a little bit of a deeper data-informed version of that. Not that folks aren't already doing their own of that with whatever the work is that they're doing. But this to me is like, if I'm doing this and I can prioritize the 3, the 5, the 10, if I'm like heavily resourced, factors that are showing up as risk factors for violence being present, is that part of the puzzle that's missing, right? And with the violence prevention navigation framework, it's brand new, right? So we know with Mufflahoon, our partner in this, that it works in the countering violent extremism space. We still need to test it in the violence prevention space, right? So our hope at some point in time is that we'll be able to work with a jurisdiction. And to be honest, we want to work with jurisdictions who want to test, who want to say like, this is brand new. I don't want to say like, this is brand new, violence prevention navigation framework, copyright it. This is it. This is the package. No, it needs to be tested. We need to tweak it, right? We need to think about how do we give people the best information that we possibly can. We don't want this to be recommendations that go into like a city or a state's violence prevention plan and it kind of just sits, right? We want this to be actionable. We want it to be data-driven. We want there to be value in the information that they're getting. We want to make sure everyone's at the table to be able to share their knowledge, their experiences. We really want to try to get the clearest, most comprehensive picture as we possibly can before we say, hey, these are our recommendations for what you can be doing. But I think what's really cool about this, it's really challenging to fund work in general, right? But if you think about it, let's go back to transportation. Most often, what funds transportation is not the same line that's funding violence prevention. So thinking about diversification of funding, thinking about how you can fund, whether it's transportation, civic engagement opportunities, right? Like it's not all coming from the same pot. So you're able to look at different ways to fund whatever your short, mid, long-term plans are, right?
Interesting.
You're also able to be thinking about, how do we do this efficiently and effectively? What's the low-hanging fruit that might cost nothing to try or to test, right? And then what are the things that we know there's significant investment in, but we can make the case for, right? And we can also say maybe it's city dollars, maybe it's federal dollars, maybe it's state dollars, maybe it's foundation dollars, maybe it's business community, right? So, and it's not always dollars, right? There are, it's people too. It's like people who have the vision, who have the skills, who have the knowledge, who have the expertise, who have the wherewithal, who want to be at the table, right? What are the things that folks can do that would move the needle on these underlying factors while other folks are working in the different spaces, right? So this is, to me, it's like just adding an additional layer onto like having a clear understanding of what exactly is happening in your city, in your community, in your neighborhood at this foundational level. And if we were to address those that are having the largest impact, both positive or negative, right, would that be a game changer? And I want to try it, right? Like I want to test that out. And I am really hopeful. We've talked to a lot of amazing people throughout the country who are interested. We have not done an engagement yet. It is brand spanking new. So this is kind of this is now we're getting into like U.S. federal proposal season. So this is an opportunity for us to say to folks that have expressed interest, hey, there might be funding available to do this. Do you want to?
You touched on a lot of elements here, but I wanted to call this one out too, in that there's wins there for other sectors too, because you framed it as an intersectoral kind of approach to addressing violence. It's not sort of public health proposes, public health gets the money. It's like, no, you can get more money for your public transport system if we get
if that's what you need to do,
right? If the evidence tells us that could help,
right?
You can employ more people, you get more and so it's not just about like, oh, let's fund public health. It's about other places. Schools might be able to get more money for more staff because evidence shows if you have this role. So I really like the endless possibilities, if you will, about the more we can drill down into understanding the causes and the contributors, you're able to then have more of a community-driven approach to addressing that.
100%. And if you think about it too, having all of those perspectives at the table, it's a very robust group of individuals who, again, if we're going back to trying to be innovative, really trying to like think about things differently, maybe that's through a different lens. Maybe it is talking about like the public health perspective with an agency or a department who that's not their functionality, right? And so it is kind of like, how do we, community, like Big C, all of us, what's the role that we can all play in this space? And for some, it will be very specifically identified things because of the fact that their sector is kind of the leader on whatever that factor is, right? Like if it is transportation, right? It's going to be the people that have the most knowledge, experience, expertise that are part of the solution, right? But they're also going to be at the table with folks, to your point, of these different, like the intersectionality across all of these different areas that I think is also this game changer of like, how do we as a city, as a county, as a state, as a neighborhood, how do we do business? How do we work together? Whether it's for the common good, but like, what can we all bring to the table that's going to move this needle? And again, like, just going back to that, like, it is this interesting thing of when folks think about it, like if you're a violence prevention professional, you might be thinking about prevention, you might be thinking about intervention, you might be thinking about credible messengers and working with individuals at highest risk, right? Because that's where your headspace is. For a lot of other people, though, the first thing you think about is law enforcement. And I feel like this is what changes that, right? This is what it's going back to, recognizing historically what's been done to community and repairing that harm.
No,
and
that's
in
a
a
good
way
framing.
that is driven by the data that shows exactly, or hopefully, right, exactly what's happening, or at least a sense of what's going on. Yeah.
No, and even thinking about social determinants of health more broadly,
Oh, gosh, yeah.
we know that access to care or medical reasons are only a percentage of what an individual needs to be healthy, and that there's other external factors that have nothing to do with access to care or someone's genetics or medical condition. It's a similar approach and a bit of a microcosm looking at gun violence that, police relations or how policing is one piece of it, but there's so many other pieces of it that could also be worked on to improve the situation. And I love the fact that there's also room there to experiment on recommendations for low resource settings, recommendations when you have bigger investments, so that there's something there for everyone all the time. It's not sort of, well, I don't have $10 million to do this, so it's just, it doesn't speak to me. It's like, well, you could potentially witness a 10% reduction if you take these smaller steps that don't require as much money. It empowers many communities to be able to do something when different recommendations speak to them, no matter what level of investment they have.
100%. I feel like it's a little bit of a roadmap, right? Like it's a little bit of like,
Google Map.
Back to your Google Map. I mean, it's this idea, right? Of like at the beginning, it's just this spotlight of like, what are we seeing, right? Like what's bubbling up? You got to dig deeper. You have to have the right people at the table. You have to have the perspective of community. You have to get a sense of the why, right? So it's almost like this like storytelling kind of like fact findery. Like this is what the data is showing us. Why? Why is it showing up this way? And then based on that, are there strategies throughout the country, right, of innovative things that are working in those spaces that maybe that's one of the recommendations, right? Or is it saying, again, like resources are limited. So if you want to try to use your resources efficiently, well, then let's kind of work through this. If we're showing that this is the greatest risk factor in this area, well, then I think you can make the case for the investment in this case, right? Our case, transportation, right? Like you can make that case, but you have to have all of that information to be able to be data-driven in your decision making. And this is, I feel like, is another tool that gets you closer to having like a comprehensive picture of what's actually happening.
So, Lori, if you had a crystal ball, so you talked about some innovative approaches from a solutions-based perspective and learning. I also want to call it also a learning tool. I think it helps to generate solutions, but at its core, it's a tool for learning and creating better understanding. What do you think the next 10 years looks like? Not from an outcome perspective, not on like we will reduce violence by expert, but more in terms of how we approach solutions and the tools that are available based on machine learning, AI, some of the work that you're doing, some of the work that you're aware of, maybe that you didn't get to speak too much on. Like, where do you see us in the next 10 years and how we, as a community, as a society, approach addressing things like gun violence or violence more broadly?
Yeah. I mean, I think what I really like about the violence prevention navigation framework is kind of something that you highlighted, which is the intersectionality across all of these different sectors. So my hope is that for the future, there is this way to be thinking about tackling this issue with like all hands on deck, right? Where it isn't just a violence prevention professional kind of focus or a law enforcement focus. I think that public health does see their role in this space, but I think that there are a lot of other sectors that don't have the ability at this point in time to recognize the role that they could also be playing. So my hope would be that as we continue with all of these all of the tools that are available to us or becoming available to us in terms of like the data analytics world and AI and all of that, are there ways to kind of marry that with community so that things are community-led, community-driven, right? Influenced by people, the knowledge and the perspective of people and their lived experiences and their, expertise of their own communities or their own, being a violence prevention professional or being an educator or whatever the case may be. Is there this way to build out, a lot of folks are talking about the ecosystem. What does that look like in the scope of the community at large, right? Or the city at large or the county at large? My hope is that there's this opportunity for all of us to come together and to play a role in making communities safer, healthier, and hopefully addressing historic inequities. But I think we could all do that if we're at the table together.
This show was edited by me, Gordon Thane, with additional editing from LaShawn Benedict. Sound design and mixing by myself and LaShawn Benedict. The original music from The Music Room, composed by Tom Fox, licensed from Johnny Harris. The cover art designed for our show by LaShawn Benedict. The Public Health Insight Podcast is produced by PHI Media. Thank you for listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast, your go-to space for informative conversations, inspiring community action. If you enjoy our podcast, be sure to subscribe and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. See you in the next one.